Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics 112. In our last video, we discussed how a purely competitive firm in a purely competitive industry, both buying and selling, sets its wage and quantity of inputs to hire, as well as if it faced a monopsony. And then we discussed what happens when unions are involved, both in a free market and when the union faces a monopsony. So, because the firm is assumed to be an infinitesimally small part of the overall market, the firm that is buying labor in a purely competitive market takes the wage rate from the prevailing market, supply and demand. Supply will equal the marginal resource cost, and demand will equal the marginal revenue product. If there are 1,000 firms, if each individual firm produces 5 and there are 200 firms, then the quantity of labor that will be hired will be 1,000. 5 times 200 is 1,000. Each firm is assumed to be identical. Since the firm is taking the price from the market, it has a perfectly elastic supply curve. Supply equal to marginal resource cost. You set that equal to marginal revenue product, and this firm will sell at that wage rate and hire this many. Will pay this wage rate and hire this many workers. Again, the worker has to pay for himself. Here, this worker's marginal revenue product is greater than the marginal resource cost, so he'll get hired. This worker won't get hired because he's only contributing this much, but the firm is paying this much. So, marginal revenue product is marginal resource cost will determine the quantity of workers hired. But, as we discussed in the prior session, a monopsonist who sees the supply curve of the entire industry, there will be a split between supply and marginal resource cost. That's because the monopsonist sees the supply curve of the entire industry, and to hire another worker, the monopsonist has to pay a higher wage rate to attract that worker. Well, he has to pay that wage rate to that worker as well as all prior workers. That means his marginal resource cost will be greater than his wage. He's going to add that wage, and he has to add a cost to all the resulting from the increased wage rate of all prior workers. So, at any given quantity, the wage rate will be lower than the marginal resource cost. So the first rule is to find the marginal resource cost equal to marginal revenue product. Go down and find that quantity. Go down to the corresponding point on the supply curve, which is equal to wage rate, and go over. And you can see that the wage rate will be lower than in a purely competitive industry where supply equals demand, where supply equals wage equals marginal resource cost, and demand equaling marginal revenue product. So a monopsonist will pay a lower wage rate and hire a lower quantity of workers than a purely competitive industry. A monopsonist is when there's only one hirer of workers, and that would, for example, be Microsoft in Seattle, Washington, where they dominate the hiring of computer analysts and programmers, perhaps. Then we explored what happens when there was a monopoly, which is an attempt to a union, which is an attempt to monopolize labor in a purely competitive market and a monopsonist market with demand enhancement, where the union advertises to consumers the product, increasing demand. When there was a craft union, for example, carpenters, electricians, and teachers, where they restrict the supply by having qualification tests. There could be people who don't have the qualification tests taken but are equally skilled. That reduces the supply. And we discussed when there was an inclusive industrial model, like at a factory like General Motors, or just like cars with a company like General Motors, or steel, for example, where they just compel the employer to pay a higher than equilibrium wage rate. Otherwise, the company will go on strike. The workers will go on strike. And so here, you get a higher wage rate and lower quantity hired, and there'll be a surplus of labor offered. And then we talk about bilateral monopsony, when a union faces off against a monopsonist. And the union will try to get the highest wage rate possible, which would be marginal revenue product was marginal resource cost, right, our decision rule. But the monopsonist will try to get where the wage rate is read from the supply curve. Since they're arguing amongst each other, the wage rate will be someplace between the wage the union wants and the wage the monopsonist wants. And that might actually approximate a purely competitive market, depending on if their negotiating position is relatively equal. If the union has more power, the wage will be set closer to marginal revenue product as marginal resource cost. The monopsonist has more power, then the wage will be set closer to the supply curve. But in addition to a purely competitive market, a monopsonist market, and a union, the government may also attempt to set wage and quantity, and that's done through a minimum wage. So a minimum wage is the least amount a business can pay for a worker, and to be effective, it has to be set above equilibrium. So here's a purely competitive market, wage and quantity of workers hired. The minimum wage has to be set above that. What's going to happen here, though, is because the wage is above equilibrium, more workers will be drawn to this industry. However, because although the wage is higher, the marginal revenue product of these workers has not changed. And so these workers will no longer pay for themselves, and so the employer will move up the demand curve and hire at a higher wage rate, the minimum wage, where the marginal revenue product is higher. So there will be fewer people hired compared to a purely competitive market, but there'll be more people seeking jobs. So this difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded will result in a surplus of labor offered. So if you're one of the lucky ones to get the job, congratulations, but there will be people who could have gotten the job at a low wage rate before, and more people who entered the workforce but won't get a job. If the minimum wage is set below equilibrium, then it will be ineffective because the market will set the wage rate. And that was true in the early O's, before the crash of 2008. There were certain industries that hired minimum wage workers, and they couldn't get enough workers because the minimum wage was not adjusted over time for inflation. And they were actually advertising that we're paying above a minimum wage rate. But what we want to do here in this video is we want to practice these scenarios ourselves. So let's take a scenario where the competency test is required. So again, this is your unions with teachers, electricians, and carpenters. We have to get a license and display some competency in the field before they let you work. That's going to reduce the supply of workers from S1 to S2. No change in demand, decrease in supply. It's going to have the effect of increasing the wage rate and decreasing the quantity of workers hired. These two curves will be shifted this way: marginal resource cost and supply 2. Originally, the monopolist will find marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost. This will go down from here until you have the quantity of labor, and from the supply curve, read the wage, the prevailing wage. Now that these curves have shifted to MRC2 and S2, again, find the MRP, MRC, go down until you hit the supply curve and go over, and wage 2. So even for a monopsonist, that will also result in an increase in wage and a decrease in the quantity of labor hired. Let's take an example of a national advertising campaign. Again, the classic example is Cesar Chavez, who led migrant workers to unionize and then tried to advertise to consumers to buy grapes picked by union workers. So the crates that you would see in the supermarket would actually have picked by union workers. And there what you're doing is you're increasing the demand for unionized workers. Because the demand for an input is derived from the demand for the product. So if they could increase the demand for the union-picked grapes, then they would increase the demand for the workers. So demand would increase for labor, and the supply would be unchanged. They would drive the wage rates up, and the number of workers employed would increase also. Theoretically, this is supposed to be the best outcome for society given unionization. However, this would be very difficult to work in the long term because you're asking consumers to pay more for an identical product just because one is picked by a union and the other isn't, which may not happen in the long run. So here, for a monopsonist, you'll get marginal revenue product equals demand 1, marginal revenue product equals demand 2, and so originally, find marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost, go down until you hit the supply curve. That will be the wage rate. Go down and hit quantity. With a new demand curve, that happens over here. Go down until you hit the supply curve, go over. Here's wage 2, a higher wage rate, and more workers are hired. Increase in demand, no change in supply, a change in quantity supplied, an increase in the wage rate, an increase in the number of workers hired. if you can get the workers to be trained to be more productive, then you will increase the demand for labor. And it has the same impact as a national advertising campaign. Both the quantity of labor will increase, and so will the wage rate in a purely competitive industry, and similarly for a monopsony. Wage rates will increase, and so will demand for the more productive labor. Identical to union advertising for buying products made by the union. A tariff, it could be that manufacturers are concerned about foreign imports and get the government to pass quotas or tariffs, which would reduce the amount of foreign goods brought into the country. As a result, there'll be an increase in demand for labor. And this will be the same as the prior two. There'll be an increase in demand for labor, increase in the wage rate, increase in the quantity of labor hired. The monopolist, again, marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost, goes down to the supply curve. That'll be the wage rate. This is nothing. No, don't worry about this intersection. It's only meant to find the quantity, and from the quantity go to supply to get the wage rate. Find the new one because of the shift in demand. Go down to the supply point. Come over. Here's the new wage rate, and here's the new quantity. Again, same as the prior two. A wage increase above equilibrium. This would be an example of an inclusive union, where everybody in the union is everybody in the factory is part of the union. This would be like General Motors or a steel company, and you get the union to agree to pay an above equilibrium wage. That's going to cause the number of workers hired to fall from purely competition, but it's going to cause the number of people who want that job to increase. So the quantity supplied of labor will go up, but the quantity demanded of labor will go down because nothing's changed the productivity of these workers. And so these people here, the quantity represented by the demand curve here, will not be hired because the marginal revenue product declines as more variable inputs are added to a fixed plant capacity, the principle of diminishing marginal product. So the newer wage rate will be higher than the competitive wage rate, but the number of workers will fall compared to a pure competitive market, and the people trying to get the job will increase. So the wage rate increases, but the quantity of people employed declines. And that's the same for here. You've got well, we'll talk about this when we talk about bilateral monopoly. Okay, so bilateral monopoly, as we discussed in just prior, is when the unions try to get the wage rate equal to the marginal revenue product equals to the marginal resource cost. Each worker pays his way. That'll be a higher rate than a purely competitive market, which can't exist if there's a monopsony and a union. When a monopsony exists and a union is going against a monopsonist, there's a split between the marginal resource cost and the supply curve. So the union will try to push that wage rate up to marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost. But the monopsonist will try to price the product where you find marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost and drop the wage rate to be read from the supply line. So that both of them will result in less workers hired compared to a purely competitive industry. But the union will seek a higher wage rate than a purely competitive industry, and the monopsonist will seek a lower wage rate than a purely competitive industry. And where it falls in between here is indeterminate. It will depend on the relative strength of each of the bargaining units of the union versus the monopsonist. Stronger union, closer to marginal revenue product, equals marginal resource cost. Stronger monopsonist, closer to the wage rate set by the supply line. This concludes our discussion of wage rate determination.